None of it is working. Okay, sorry about it. There was a false start because the screen was freezing. I hope you are able to see the screen. Are you?
Yeah, ma'am, I'm able to see.
Okay. Today's lecture is going to be on socio-spatial spaces and policy implication. Prior going to it, let me introduce myself. My name is Bhuvana, and I will be teaching you the course on Social Structures 1. And just to give a brief introduction about myself, I am trained as an architect and subsequently as a planner. But my PhD is in an interdisciplinary studies. It draws from social policy, anthropology, and political science. And the PhD itself deals with the politics of urban development. I largely work and research on cities. Yeah. So what came to your mind when you saw this course on social structure? Hello?
Yeah, ma'am, I have no idea regarding this, but I know it deals with policy and analyzing the policies.
Okay. There are other people who have joined Ion and Tej, etc. Ah. Uh-huh. Hello? Ayan? Hello?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning. Yes, ma'am. Good morning.
Mind when you saw the topic of this lecture and when you saw this? We are a small group, so let's get to know. Let's make it a conversation style, and in between, I give the points for the lecture. Yeah. So, Ayan, what it came to your mind when you saw this lecture? Topic of this lecture. It's titled as spaces. And if you were present in my introduction, I did say that I teach social structure, and I come from an architecture background. Yeah.
Ma'am, I would say, ma'am, nothing is such like, I mean,
It's okay.
Yes.
It's okay. It's okay. Let's hold it. I'll come back to all of you with this question as we go through this lecture. Tej, Ayan, what's your background, if I can ask that?
Sure, ma'am. Ma'am, I gave from an ISC background from like humanities. I had sociology, psychology, political science, economics, English, and physical education as my sixth subject. And yes, and like I'm very interested in environment and marathon running and basketball. Yes, sir. Thank
Tej, what about you?
Good morning, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Ma'am, I have been in 2 years in OPGMS, 8 years in boarding in Bishop Cotton School. I'm from Saket, and I've done 4 years in sciences, PCM.
Sciences. Bishop Cotton is Bangalore, or where did you say?
Shimla.
Shimla. Okay. Ashok, you've been waiting for a long time.
Good morning, ma'am.
Yeah.
I came from ISC background, and my subjects are history, economics, commerce, and accountancy.
Okay, fine. That's interesting. You are an interesting group. Okay, and this particular lecture is part of your first core course on social structure. Now, what is this course about? the social structure course draws on sociology, yeah.
Yes.
And it is based on Wright Mills. There was an author called Arthur Wright Mills. He is a famous sociologist, and he floated this concept called sociological thinking. Okay, and what it means is very much about. Ashok, you can mute the mic if it is. Yeah. What it means is basically how do you think about this society using a sociological lens. Okay, and there is another recent sociologist who's very famous, who's called Bauman. And Bauman also wrote this famous book called Thinking Like a Sociologist. Yeah, I lay this out for you in the introduction because what you're going to get in social structure is not a conventional sociological course, but to think about society using some of the concepts laid by different scholars. And it is within this light, space became one of the dominant themes in recent times. Yeah. The next slide, I'm going to put in some sentences. Just think of these sentences, because when you think about sociology is also a discipline that deals with our everyday life. It tells us about how we relate to the society and how society relate to us. It's vice versa. Okay, and then this relationship manifests in different ways. It manifests in everyday communication, the language we use. Having said this, I'm laying out a few sentences in the next slide, and I hope you can read the slide. Can you see the slide? Hello?
Ma'am, we can't see the slide.
You can't see the slide. Okay. Can you now?
Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. There are a few sentences. Okay. It starts with what is space. These sentences, I've laid these sentences to allow us to think through what do they mean by space, because after all today's lecture is about space and place, and how does it connect to sociological thinking, and why is it space became an important topic in social sciences, and how is it relevant for policy formulation or thinking through whether this is an appropriate policy or not. Yeah. So first sentences, think of these sentences in everyday use. People would have commonly told you, know your place. Yeah. Or they would have tell you, put her in her place. Or this is my space. Give me some space. Kitchen is a gendered space. Slums are dangerous spaces. What comes to your mind when you look through these various sentences? Anybody? Hello? Are you all there?
Yes.
Okay, let's take the first sentence. Yeah, go on.
Ma'am, it is there's a hierarchical structure.
Yeah.
Yes,
Exactly.
ma'am.
Yes,
Maybe
you're.
like
Yeah.
divided by maybe divided by like socially divided or economically divided. That they live in slums, that they are economically backward and socially backward. That's why like they are in the slums, and like leave them in their places, and like that.
Okay. Yes, you're right. It signify a hierarchy, right? We are marking a hierarchy. We are saying slums are lower down, and the hierarchy is marked by the adjective dangerous. Okay. You are economically, if slums are economically dominated by economically poor people, how does this adjective dangerous come into being? And it's something that we all believe, right? It's something that we are constantly told. Very often when I ask some of my students to go on research in slums, the first thing they come back and say, am I safe? Can I go into the slums? Yeah. If the only difference is about between some of them is over class, like Ashok rightly pointed out, where from we are getting this idea that we have to fear what is a slum, we have to worry about our security, right? Keep that question. And the other things, like you said, there's a hierarchy. And there is a hierarchy which is very much linked to putting people in specific slots. Yeah. So when you're putting people in your specific slots, what are you doing? You are drawing a boundary. You're drawing the boundary of you have to be there. You cannot step out of the boundary. Okay. Look at the sentence. Kitchen is a gendered space. Okay. What does that mean? It's a gendered space. Basically meaning it's a space belonging to a specific group. It's a woman-centric space. Yeah. But cooking can be done across the sexes. Why is it that kitchen becomes a gendered space? If any of you are interested, one of the things that I will be doing throughout the course is using fictions to understand society. And a fiction that I would like to bring here is writing by an author called C.S. Lakshmi. She is also known by the name Ambai. She wrote this novel on kitchen as a woman's space. Yeah, and the protagonist of this novel talks about women, their isolation from the private spaces, and how their whole world revolves around the kitchen. And how does this marking of their spaces within the kitchen also have a larger implication, to use Ashok's terminology, in terms of marking hierarchy? Who should decide what within the home? Who has the right to move out into the public space, and who has to be confined within a particular space? So this movement across the boundary, can you hear? Hello, can all of you
Yeah.
hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Across the street, it's also defined by marking where one should belong. So what does this all tells you about space and place? Space is simply a marking, locating bodies, whether it is individual or community, within a particular boundary. And this boundary act is very, very critical, like, because it affects your fortune in society, because it affects what you can do, whether you can realize who you are, and whether you can realize your potential to its fullest. And these boundaries themselves can come in terms of caste, like class. It can come in terms of race. It can also come in terms of citizenship, right? And that is why space became an important place. Space become an important aspect of discussion within sociology. Space is simply, it's also abstract. If you think of space, how can I think of space? I can think of spaces in any dimension. You can think of space in a material sense, which is very concrete. That is your slum. A slum defines a physical place. It is visible. It has a concrete boundary. You can also understand who are the people who are living there and what are the characteristics, and you make certain assumptions about how they are likely to behave, and therefore how you are likely to respond to them. Okay. And second, spaces can also be extremely abstract. Think of social spaces. Social spaces are marked by caste. It's marked by gender. It's marked by various other markers of identity. So one of the things that when you're thinking about society, all of us are members of society. And society itself is organized, as you know, along several institutions, and family becomes the most basic unit of this institutional arrangement. So whether it is a family or it's the community, we draw spaces. Yeah, we draw space in, and this boundary is about who's inside, who's outside, who can do what, and who has the power to do what. Yeah. So space is this marker. It is marked. Its physical manifestation comes in terms of how you mark the boundary and who does this act of marking the boundary. But if I say women has to be confined in gendered space, women who are affected by this marking in a patriarchal society are not going to keep quiet. There is always this contestation to straddle the boundary, to expand the confines of the boundary, to erode the boundary. And these contestations you find in terms of social movements, you find in terms of everyday contestations over who should get what in society or within the family. Take, for example, the debate on reservations. Yeah. If I stop here and I were to ask you, how do you understand the debates on reservation? Because there are two sides to the coin, right? Two sides to the debate. One group will say, oh, no, 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 reservation is not needed. You are basically having an easy take on societal resources, whereas we, the people who are left out of reservation, are working so hard and we are missing out the opportunities. The other group says, sorry, but we are in this position historically because of the historical discrimination that we faced. And so as a society, you have a responsibility to redeem our position. So reservation then becomes a tool to redeem our position, to redeem the injustices that were met to us. So there are always this contestation, and these contestation find its expression in certain specific policy tool. Am I clear till now?
Yes,
Hello?
ma'am.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the reasons that we think about spaces and how we connect to the policy is also about how are these spaces, spatial boundaries marked? What are the processes by which these boundaries are laid out? And how do people who are affected by this boundary process respond to it? And what are its manifestations or what are its translation in policy process? Say, for example, take the case of slums. Slums is an example of a boundary drawn within physical spaces. Yeah? Now, what distinguishes a slum from a non-slum? Now, the connotation is, if you study urban studies, a slum by definition is simply about any place which is deficient of infrastructure, which is derelict. The buildings are dilapidated, it can fall at any time, and it's dangerous for people to live in such conditions. Yeah. But very often slums take another meaning. If you talk about, if you must have read in the papers, and you must have read in the papers about evictions, you must have also read this paper about these are encroachers. Yeah. So often the association of people who live in spaces that are marked as slums are that of encroachers. So what does the term encroachers tell you? Encroach is all about you are violating something. So the term slums, from its original meaning of a place, which is something, which is a place that is dangerous to live. Dangerous in the sense it's dangerous for human habitation. It's dangerous to the people who are living to a legal connotation of people who are violating law. And therefore, this association of slums or dangerous spaces pushes this entire group of people as somehow hostile and dangerous to the community where they are living. So basically, and while squatter dwellers, if you speak to them, they will tell you they are like any of us. They are laboring bodies. They work in factories. They work very hard in various types of daily labor. And for instance, without them, very often many of these cities won't function. Whether it's the construction work, or whether it's the domestic work, or whether it is the everyday sanitation, your workers come from places that are called slums. Yet, the relationship to the city is often marked by hostility. We are dependent on them, yet we are hostile on them, and we are constantly trying to restrict the spaces that they can occupy within a city. So, to cut it short, what the politics of space is very much about locating us, whether we are individuals or communities, within a physical grid. Sometimes this grid is extremely visible, and sometimes, as in the case of caste, as in the case of religion, as in the case of ethnicity, it's very invisible. These are all social spaces. You can also think of space as ecological space. Think of a river. A river, you can think of it as simply the water body, which you can consume at your will, or you can think of a river as a living system. And the living system, in the latter thinking, a river as an ecological space becomes an ecosystem. It takes on an ecosystem being. It is about how different living and non-living beings are in some symbiotic relationship to each other. So the very much about space is also, you can think of space in different ways, and it connotes various forms of boundaries that we lay. And coming from the last example that I gave you about ecological space, you can draw this boundary very flexibly. It depends on how you're interpreting the meaning of that particular space. Okay? And third, space is this boundary, act of defining boundary is a very contested process. There is one group which tries to restrict the boundary, restrict the spatial boundary, draw the boundary as narrow as possible. And people who are caught within this boundary always contest to expand it. So this boundary process itself is a very contested process. It can happen socially. You think of all the caste politics that happens. You think of the conflicts over whether we have to have reservation or not. You think of the conflict about citizenship, CAA register that and the Shaheen protest that followed it. And also you can think it up as the evictions and demolitions that you're finding it, you are witnessing every day in different cities. It also finds its expression as feminist movements. So all of these are contestations about how you define space and how the recipients of that definition are responding to this act. Okay. Now, how does this connect to policy? Because policy is not a straightforward engineering linear process. Okay. There's a particular who defines policy and how they defined it are closely related, because the interpretation of a problem is very much dependent on the lens you use to see society. For example, I used to work with squatter and slum accreditation, and I've witnessed two kinds of bureaucrats. I've seen bureaucrats who take this very brash view that all squatter settlements are encroachers or illegal people, let's get rid of them. I've also witnessed other group who comes from the angle, no, squatters are people who are very much needed to society, and the reason they are in that situation today is because somewhere the city has failed to provide adequate housing for everyone in society. So it's a societal problem. So depending on where you come from, who you are, and what are the lenses you use to understand the world, you can either reduce the problem to an individual problem, or you can see it as a structural and a systematic problem in society. And this affects how you shape policies, how you implement policies, how you flexibly interpret policies. Yeah? We will go in deep during the classes, this being a very short lecture. I just give you the flavor of where does this connections go on. We'll talk about how much you're doing. We are able to go through it today. Before proceeding further, I hope I'm okay. Everybody is clear. I'm able to, I hope you're able to follow, or I hope I am clear, whichever way you take it. Yeah. Hello?
Yeah, ma'am, you're clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's think of this lens of physical and social space through the lens of few stories, 3 stories. All 3 stories come from a very famous writer called Mahashweta Devi from India. She writes a lot on story, and these 3 stories I picked up are from a collection called Breast Story. Okay. Mahashweta Devi worked with the tribals in this country, and she also wrote about their conditions. And the manner in which she communicated the situation, and the manner in which she, in communicating the situation of tribals, she used fiction as a genre. And these fictions are not fictitious in the sense they are imaginations of our mind, but they are drawn from everyday life. Yeah. I picked up 3 stories to look at the situation of different groups, different identity groups. You would have followed from the talk till now. One of the critical ways in which we mark us and others, them, is by marking boundary. Look at these terms. we are Indians, they are Pakistanis, us and them. This markings us and other is very, very critical to the politics of drawing spaces. So if you look at the sociological text, it's often written as self and the other, the othering process. The othering process is very much about how do you draw the boundary of who's inside us and who's outside us. Is it only abstract social thing? Not really. Think of your property. Think of your plot. What do? You draw a plot boundary, and that is your property rights. In defining your property rights to a land or to a house, this boundary is very, very critical. What are you telling by this boundary act is that you're telling very clearly, these are the people who can be inside the boundary. They can be inside the boundary of my house. These are the people who can have access into my house or into my land on a certain conditions. Then those who are not fitting within this, my definition of who can enter in or who can enter on which condition, are all trespassers. So your property rights is also a way of marking space. Your property relations is also marking this boundary. And your property relations of who can rent, who can lease, and how can they rent, how can they lease, who can own, how can they use the land, which is very much translated in policy as master planning and zoning, are all limited to, are all linked to this wider societal process of space and drawing spatial boundaries. Now, it is in this vein, if you take Draupadi, the first story, Draupadi is a story of a tribal woman set in the times of 1971. It's set during the war between Pakistan and Bangladesh. And if you know Bangladesh, and I had a very close friend who used to be my classmate and who was also a victim of this genocidal rape, thousands of women were victims of this rape. And particularly, this classmate of mine whom I met while studying outside India, her father was a bureaucrat, and he was a bureaucrat within the Bangladeshi, the then East Pakistan bureaucratic order. So when the West Pakistan military came in, one of the group that was targeted, her family was targeted, and her family had to move from place to place, and they had to find new hideouts almost every day. And in the course of this fleeing from one place to another, she and her sister were somehow spotted by the Pakistani army, and they were violently raped. So the story that and the whatever victimization to her body had a very lasting impact, because I met her very much 20 years after the war had taken place. She came in to study as a middle-aged woman, but the Draupadi story is very much linked to it. Draupadi was also a victim of genocidal rape. Draupadi was caught when the Pakistani, if you know Bangladesh and if you know the border between India, Pakistan, particularly Chittagong, Shillong, all of these borders are very, very gray areas. For the tribals, they operate across both the country space. They are both Indians, and the forest is their space, right? So the nation space, the national boundaries, which is a political boundary, doesn't make much meaning to them in their everyday life. So Draupadi used to traverse across both boundaries, and during one of the crossings, she was caught by the army, and the army officer orders his unit to rape her violently. Now, after the rape was over, ironically, the soldiers advised her to cover herself, to protect herself, to cover herself in order for dignity, which is an ironical statement itself. But Draupadi defies, and she says she remains naked and with her gaping wounds, which leave the army officer completely startled. Now, what is this act of rape, and how did Draupadi respond to it? Rape is a common trope. Rape is a trope that you find across communities, whether it is Hindu-Muslim riot in this country, or it is the partition riots, or it is the African-American versus white American white American conflicts, or you find in the institutional racism within UK, or you find in the wars that happened in Africa, whether it's Uganda or it is Eritrea. You can take every case. Rape becomes a trope. What does this rape tell you? Rape is drawing the space not just of where the woman should be, which you find in everyday expression. It's also drawing the space of marking the inferior status of a particular community. When Draupadi is raped, or when an Eritrean woman was raped in the conflict between two groups, one group is marking the state of the other group as inferior by using women's body. Okay, so part of the spatial contestation, bodies become central. Bodies become central to this contestation. Violence that is imposed on bodies is very much integral to this spatial processes. Yeah? And it can happen over bodies, and it can also be extended to beyond the bodies. The second story which I wanted to tell you, and sorry, there is a little thing. Yeah, and after the rape, what they could found is that the army officers could never break them psychologically, could never break Draupadi psychologically. Draupadi declares, and this is how the story closes, "They ain't a man here that I should be ashamed of. What more can you do? You have been so violent. You have removed me, removed every dignity that I had left of me." Okay, but how do you, what is Draupadi's reaction to? It's not the male leadership that is bringing resolution to the story, but it is Draupadi's courage and strength that challenges the patriarchy. Now, this challenging the spatial boundaries and challenging the process of violence that is spanning out of this space, whoever is defining the boundary, i.e., whoever has the power to control one body over the others, its manifestation happens in different ways. Draupadi kind of challenged it by using her own body. And this is an act that you will find, you can use this metaphor to understand different conflicts in society. You look at Dalit cases, you look at the circumstances of Dalits, the historically marginalized group in our society, tribals. Tribals are one group which are historically marginalized. Is Draupadi an isolated story? Not really. If you go into the communities which are very close to where tribals are residing, say for example, if you go into Western Ghats, particularly if you know Bangalore, if you know Mysore, there is this place called the Mysore Tamil Nadu border. It's a forested area. And it's also a place where one of the famous sandalwood dacoit came. His name is Veerappan. Probably all of you were children by the time this incident happened in the late 80s, early 90s. And if you take that area, now a lot of the tribal spaces became state spaces because they are forests, they are valuable resources, they hold valuable resources. So when the British moved into this country and they wanted timber as for their extensive construction activity, for example, laying out the roads and then starting out the printing paper press, particularly for laying the railways, for constructing, for their major construction process, timber was very, very critical. And the Indian forest had plentiful source of timber. Besides, forests were also had very valuable trees, your sandalwood tree, your oak tree. They are also the spaces where you find variety of herbs, it's a space of biodiversity. So forest is also, the biodiversity is also an opportunity for converting it into economic wealth. And therefore, one of the things that the British did was they took over forest and declare or forest land or public land. And today, even after independence, we continue with the process. So who owns the forest is a constant fight that you will find within the tribal stories. Now, is the story valid today? Yes. If you look at a recent environmental impact assessment, and if you know one part of the story, why it is also coming. You all are following the environmental impact assessment debate. Hello? Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, I don't follow that.
Okay, the environmental impact assessment, the recent one that's coming in, the earlier environmental impact assessment had something called social impact assessment. And the social impact assessment followed a principle that if you're particularly using the land of tribals or you're using a land of some other group, say farmers, you have to have an assessment or have an evaluation of how does it affect the groups which are already dependent on or which already have a greater claim over that space. Now, this was affecting the implementation of major infrastructure projects, say particularly the tribal lands. You all, if you all have followed the Narmada Bachao Andolan movement, it was very much linked to construction of larger dams. Yeah, and the movement itself, spearheaded by environmentalists, subsequently, to cut the story short because we don't have time, kind of put a hold on the project. The World Bank, which was a major funder, withdrew, and Government of India, along with several state governments, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan, had to stop the project midway. Now, the argument against that project, the dams, as all of you know, is that it not only destroys several acres of forest land, but it also, because you're cutting the forest and you're also altering the course of the water, it results in inundation. It results in frequent flooding as well as permanent loss of forest land, which is because of one-time inundation when you're constructing the dam. So both the environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment were started to assess and mitigate these kind of losses, ecological loss, and it also has social repercussions. Now, when India then it's just not India, every worldwide, when this whole tenet of globalization becomes the only way of development, along with it came this idea of the bigger the infrastructure, the larger the infrastructure, then only you can globalize. Now, if you have to have, one is infrastructure. For building the infrastructure, you need, what do you need? You need minerals, you need steel, you need land, you need timber. So all of it, certain spaces became very contentious. Land, where do you go for land? If it is in the area which is a non-tribal area, of course your agricultural land becomes important. You have to somehow take it out of them, out of the farmers. If you have to go into a forest area where tribals have a greater claim to it, and also in law we had a particular provision which is called the Scheduled Area Acts, which gives the tribals greater claim. So you cannot take the land very easily. And if you have this environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment, it was acting as a barrier for land acquisition. So the present environmental impact assessment suggests that if I want to convert, or if I have a proposal to develop a mine in a particular area, I don't need to have an environmental impact assessment. The person who's floating the proposal, i.e. the capitalist, can always take a one-time clearance from the government and start the ore, which means the groups that are affected will no longer have a say over it. Now, to facilitate this process, there were several other things that happened. One is the Land Acquisition Act itself was altered. Second, they are altering the various processes that are linked to land acquisition, just like environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment. Third, as an extension, what is likely to happen is that they'll also have a new institution which will make this decision, which will allow you to swim past some of the barriers that you had in the earlier processes. Yeah. So basically, you can see my idea is not to draw your attention to the debates of environmental impact assessment, but to use it as an example to see how the contestation to draw spaces get played out in everyday life, and how does it affect communities, and how do communities react. And this contestation can happen from individual bodies, as you see in the case of Draupadi, and to what is happening with to the level of communities, the bodies of the tribals who inhabit a forest space. So since in the interest of the time, the other two cases that I wanted to bring to your notice is, one is called Draupadi represents the case of a tribal woman, a woman who's poor, a woman who's occupying an inferior position within society. The second story within the same collection is about Behind the Bodies, which is talking about migrant labor. And the story itself revolves around migrant laborer and a photographer who makes her breast as an object of his photography. And it's particularly it's looking at individual obsession of what we see as art, how we see this world, and without taking into account the interest of the subject, here the migrant labor, and how he is affected by this act, and how does society sanctions or approves this act is the essence of the second story. And the third story, the best story by which this whole thing goes in, is to illustrate all of us have very complex identity. When we talk about black, white, Dalit, non-Dalit, or then men, women, migrant, native, we all occupy a very ambiguous space. Yeah, we are all hybrid identities. I'm this, I am that. Sometimes my identity allows me to negotiate a particular space of constraint, and introducing steps to eradicate the barrier or erode the barrier, policies become central. Sorry, deals with the marginalized Brahmin woman who used to sell her breast because she used to act as a wet nurse because of her poverty, her wealthy family. And it then talks about the two families, her relationship seems to suffer. Both the families just ignores her. They not only reject her, they condemn her. So what the breast story can also be read of is the identity and the ways in which both intra-community relationship and inter-community relationship are structured in a society. Is this very specific to our community societies alone? No, this struggle goes on throughout. I think you all might have seen this movie called James Baldwin. Have you heard of his name? Hello?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
Okay, James Baldwin was lived at the same time as Martin Luther King Jr. He is an African American writer who wrote extensively about the ordeal of black men and women. And whilst there are several stories, James Baldwin also had a difficult relationship to the society because of his sexuality as well as his blackness. He is a homosexual at a time in the 70s when gay marriages was not approved in society, in American society, in any European society, and when the church had a greater stronghold of what is marriage and who should be married to whom and what should be the role of the family, etc. This is a book that was published in If Beale Street Could Talk, and it also came out as a movie subsequently, which was again taken by an African American director, which I forget. But what is this movie about? The movie revolves around two protagonists, Tish, a 19-year-old African American girl and her boyfriend Fonny, who's a sculptor. Tish and Fonny start as a childhood friend, and then they get together and try to find a house. Both of them grew up in Harlem. Harlem is a neighborhood that is dominated by poor African American families, and Harlem also has the connotation of dangerous spaces that as we talk about the squatter settlements of India. Now, Tish and Fonny, after several attempts, could never find a house in Lower Manhattan simply because they were black. None of the white landlords were willing to give them a house. Eventually, a Jewish landlord who has interest, not because of their blackness, who has interest in supporting romances, allowed them to stay in his loft. Now, one. And number two, during the course of their life in that neighborhood, one day Tish goes to a neighborhood grocery store to buy tomatoes, where she is subjected to both verbal abuse and physical harassment by Italian white men. Now, the various people, the white people who are there witnessed the event, but none of them protest, or none of them come to the protection of Tish. At one point, Tish really lost her temper and she slaps the man. At that point, there is a white officer, Beale, enters the scene and he tries to accuse Tish. In between, Tish's boyfriend Fonny comes in and he slaps the white man. Now, instead of addressing the white offender, the officer tried to take Fonny to the police station. And although Tish used her body as a shield to protect Fonny from the police officer that day, subsequently Fonny was arrested. His friend Danny was arrested of a theft of car, even though he doesn't know to drive the car. Both Fonny and Tish are also subjected to rape within the prison, because prison life is extremely harsh. And so does Tish. What it does is, if you look at the Beale Street in detail, you find several themes, several forms of exclusion of how the effects of these boundaries, effects of social boundaries that we are drawing, and the manner in which we relate to the people on the other side of the boundary. See, for example, housing market exclusion, which I told you. Why? Because African American people are supposed to be criminals, they're supposed to be deviants, and therefore law-abiding good family will not rent to them. And how does this apply to India? In India, if you look at it, if you look at how housing markets work, particularly rental markets, and also if you look at who transacts with whom, caste becomes central to these transactions. And particularly, and this is very, very central, if you look at economies, how we are organized, as all of you know, and now self-employment, a lot of us Indian, more than 60%, have to find their own jobs. They have to create their own forms of livelihood opportunities. The luxury of finding a government employment or finding a paid employment in the private sector is limited. It's not. However, whilst the policy is extremely comfortable talking about formal and informal, oh, these people are not in the paid jobs or not in the government because of ABCD, the reality is I have to do my own livelihood opportunity. If I move into business or if I move into manufacturing, and you look at how manufacturing industries are organized, take for example Tirupur. If you know Tirupur has the largest textile industries units in the country. It's all units that is organized around small and medium scale production. Tirupur produces for the global market. And interestingly, a lot of these units are run by a maximum 4 or 5, and sometimes you will find the owner himself working along with the laborers. It's often difficult to figure out who's the owner and who's the laborer in these offices. Now, while whilst if you look at the story of Tirupu's entrepreneurs, how they came up in life and how they are able to enter into the textile industry, you find caste as a central organizing unit. Majority of them come from a particular caste and they extend both financial and other forms of support to members of their own community to start their small units. Now, the groups which is excluded, okay, they come from largely a middle class. Now, a Dalit person who's working as a laborer with no finance, even though he may have a skill, can no way enter into this business because of the way caste networks operate. And I think very recently, if you see in the paper, there is also an article which talks about the Brahminical networks of MPs. How do MPs of a particular caste, they flock together and then they try to organize it. Now, I say this because you think through, we cannot resolve in 1 hour all these issues, but these are some of the issues we'll be doing it. And think of, this is one issue. The way this exclusion happens, the way we use is by the way we understand others, by the prejudices and biases that are built into our understanding. And these prejudices and our biases are a product of a historic history. We are learned. Many of these things we learn subconsciously. We don't even know that we are racist, we are casteist, because we believe that if we believe constantly, no, I am a very generous person. I am a very progressive person. Yet, if society is a sum of actions, societal act is a sum of actions of all individual actions, how do we explain that these events of racist behavior, racial practices, is it very much an individual act of landlords? Not really. If you look at the housing market inequalities in the US, African Americans are systematically excluded both from the mortgage market and from the state policies that work against their interest. And you will find similar accusations from members of the Dalit community against the mainstream community in the Indian context. Think about it, and we will think through this in the course of the class. Now, in both these acts, the bodies become available for consumption and abuse, whether you take the female body or you take the male laboring body of people, depending on how we locate them in the social spaces, and they are subjected to violence, various forms of violence, right from passive gaze, passive consumption, to active act of rape, to active act of abuse of their laboring bodies. And this violence is inscribed in institutions. If you look at the criminal justice system, is a classic example, whether it's India or whether it's America or whether it is UK, you can array a range of evidence from different contexts to show how this is inscribed in systemic violence, and it affects the bodies, affects all of us differently. To conclude, I draw on the concept of a famous sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu, who said all of us, well, while we policies and a number of social science subjects assume that all of us as human beings are occupying the same space, it's not really. Our spaces are marked. Our spaces are marked in such a way, some of us have greater opportunities than others. And the spatial marking, or sometimes symbolic, sometimes it's very visible and marked in terms of which are the physical places that you can live, which are the physical places that you can enter, and what are the codes for entering that particular place. All of these are about how we contest to claim societal resources. And this is what we'll be dealing with in our course on social structure. We won't be packing it like this. We'll be dealing it, taking one theme at a time, such as freedom, individual. What does it mean to be freedom? To be free. Are we really free? How does embeddedness affect us? And how are this freedom, duty delineated? Who delineates it? Which brings us to the question of power, and how is it enforced? foremost, again, the question of power. What is the role of institutions in this act? And what connects all of it to conclude is this act of drawing spatial boundaries in various ways and enforcing it, and the contestation to erode the boundary. I stop here. We can open it up for discussion. Hello?
Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah. Feel free. You don't have to be, there's no right or wrong. I lay the rules of my class. There are no right or wrong. All of us, we can draw on our life experience and we can try to understand the world. Okay. The important thing is we need to relook at ourselves and relook at our thinking process and understand our relationship to society and understand how society relates. That's the essence of this course. So do not feel anxious or shy about, none of us are going to judge anybody. And so feel free to open up and ask questions. You're free to say, I don't agree with any of that you said. And we can talk about it, why I say what I said and why you don't agree with what I say. Yeah. Hello?
Ma'am, yeah. Ma'am,
Yeah.
you have said that like women, they are kept in some spaces, they are certainly, some say that these spaces are only for women, and like as you have said just in the slide one. So,
Yeah.
ma'am, there should be someone in the space, ma'am. Like, if there's no one in that space, nothing could happen, right? So, why do you generalize like only? Like, my question is, ma'am, for example, you have said in slide one that kitchen is a space for women. Yeah. So, if there is no one in the kitchen, how could like anything go on?
Okay. Yeah, this is a debate. This is a debate within the feminist thing, right? Now, why should kitchen, if nobody is there in the kitchen, how can the kitchen go on? Okay. And therefore, the work is assigned to the women. The question that feminists ask you is, fine, it's true. Kitchen is what? It's a place for cooking food, right? And food is consumed by you and me and everybody. Yeah. And it can be done by anyone. If you look at cooking as an act, it can be done by anyone. But what do you do by defining that women has to belong to the kitchen? You're also defining that they have to be confined to their homes. They had to be confined to their spaces, to private space. It also follows, it's just not about cooking. It's about how do you divide, how do you arrive at a division of labor within home. What is the division of labor within home? So women does two things. That is what is broadly called in the literature as reproduction. And reproductive role is not only about childbirth. Each one of us have to, we literally, if you know the gene theory, several genes die within us and then it's kind of reborn every day. For our own survival, we need to reproduce every day. We need to sleep for our brains to work. We need our body to be replenished in order to function the next day. So women perform this reproductive role. Okay, and man goes out and supposedly produces wealth, and this could be in the form of taking up a job in a factory, in employment, etc. Now, because you bring in money, because our understanding of power, both jobs are important. Both reproduction is important and production is important. But because of the way, because you have to traverse into the public space for generating wealth, and that is controlled by men, a certain type of power relations enter the household. You also find a hierarchy subtly expressed. If you're born, are you a single son or do you have a sister?
I have a brother, ma'am.
You have a brother. Okay, speak to girls and ask them, how easy is it to make a decision? Whether it's a decision to study or decision to go out and travel alone or decision to take a particular work. Everything is patterned by the marriage. And what does marriage subtly says? It is about you're going to be within the control of a man who has a responsibility to find who can go out in the public space and earn money. Your earning is secondary, and therefore you have to be confined to the private space. You have to take care of the kitchen. So the kitchen politics itself goes beyond. It goes beyond cooking food. It goes beyond what you will do, what you can do, whether you can realize your responsibility. I have an aspiration to become a writer, but my entire time is spent in kitchen and spent in household work, that none of the other members of the family are willing to share it on the ground. That's my responsibility. Women's responsibility is the kitchen. Men need not enter. This may seem very simplistic, but if you look at the COVID-19 academic politics of publishing, and if you look at who could publish and who couldn't publish during the space, even though both male and female academics are at the same level, because they've gone through the same PhD process, they've gone through the same tenure process. Women, because of the extra burden that they had to take of taking care of the family, were affected, and men could sit all this time and write, whereas women had to struggle between fulfilling their taking care of their family, of their children, and then by the end of it come to work. So what it does is this simple act of division of labor, and how the division of labor gets concretized over time also layers a power relationship between two. And this power relations imbalances one group's ability to negotiate the world, to negotiate and realize their aspirations. It also affects their opportunities. Now, if I take this female academic and she comes in for promotion within a workplace, it's going to be, you are not publishing, and you're not publishing because you're not capable. The language translates and pushes the problem back onto the woman. So the question is not, it's the same narrative you can see in reservation. The question is not about somebody has to be there. The question is, why can't this somebody be anybody? Why should it be very gendered? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. You can think about it and we can come back and debate in class. Okay. Any other question? Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
No, it's clear. No question from my side.
Yeah. Okay. Can we agree on one thing? Maybe you need time to think through. When you come to my first class on 1st of September, can you all write a short note on what came to your mind? What are your impressions of the space as a metaphor? What you heard in this lecture? Where could you agree with the points? Where do you strongly disagree? You are absolutely free to disagree with anything you like, because when you're doing this course, what is very, very critical is you develop your thinking. Okay, marks and grades and all are secondary to this process. What is important is you learn to be a critical thinker, and that is what will help you to become a good policy maker, or to understand policies in a very societal perspective, not about good and bad. Everything in this world is not black and white. There are a lot of grayness, and we need to understand it, and a policy maker has to straddle it very carefully. So basically, when you come back, what this class expects is much more debates and much more thinking and more autonomous ideas, because nobody is right or wrong. Everyone is coming from their life experience. So please, can you think through the themes that came up in this lecture, and you can write a short essay and bring it to class. Is it possible?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Tej, you have been very quiet.
Yes, ma'am, I'll get.
You're a sociologist, right?
Me?
Yeah, yeah. Did you do sciences or sociology? You
No,
came
I'm a
from
scientist.
Bishop Sciences. Ashok, I think the sociologist, Ian left, and I think Ian is a sociologist. Yeah. If you have, if you don't have any other points, we can close the session. What do you think?
Yes, I'm clear. No points.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you say that again, ma'am? That what should we write right before coming to the class? I am not getting it.
Basically, you listen to whatever various things that I told about space, right? I can share the slides with you. Okay.
Yes, yes.
You can pick up anything from your everyday life. You can think about caste, or you can think about gender, or like the question he asked, right? Shouldn't we assign somebody to the kitchen space? What is wrong with women being in the kitchen space? Write a reflection. If you were to write a blog article, blog entry, how will you do it? Yeah. You can take any theme. You can take a book. You can take something that happened in your life and reflect through what I said. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can be highly critical. What is important is you think on your own. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.